Hi, my name is Matt Bellis. I'm an analyst on CMS. I'm a faculty member at Siena College, and I have been working for a little while now with Gabriele and Cezanne to try to put together a talk that outlines the scope of an analysis. Some of you are fairly advanced in this process, but maybe new to CMS. Some of you are really just at the beginning of this type of physics work. And so what we wanted to do is put together something that kind of gives you the broad scope in the very, very simplest, most basic terms. And then over the next 2 weeks, you'll be learning more of the details and how to fill in those cracks, if you will, in your knowledge. And this won't be covered in just the next 2 weeks. This will be the next few years of your work on CMS. So I'm going to jump right in and we'll work through this. This is, again, not going to cover everything. It's really hopefully just to get you started on the right foot. So as I said, I'm not going to provide all the answers for you. I'm not really going to tell you how to do your analysis. I'm just going to walk you through everything. If anything, what I want to do is prime you with a bunch of questions. And these questions are things you should be asking yourself, as well as the facilitators as you go through both the short and the long exercises. And by asking these questions and getting answers, hopefully you will be more prepared to do your own analysis. So we're going to walk through all the little steps in a very cartoonish fashion. It might not be the way everybody thinks about an analysis. This is just the way I and some of my colleagues and collaborators have chosen to present this, but there are many ways to work through this. When you're done with CMS DAS at the end of the next 2 weeks, I strongly encourage you to come back to this talk, see if it made sense, go through the slides, and if they did, that's great. If they didn't, please provide feedback to us. And for a much more detailed and really comprehensive talk, I provided a link in the slides to a talk that Cezanne gave with much more details and links to specific procedures that you may want to use. Okay? But I'm going to jump right in again to something very simple. I'm going to continue to talk about what this talk is not. So I am not going to show you, like from the very beginning, how to get from hits to signals to 4 vectors. This is going to be at a much higher level. During the week, you will learn about this process. But we're really going to be starting from the idea of 4 vectors. Some of you may do analyses where you need to go back to the beginning and redo some of the tracking. Some of you may wind up doing service work where you'll be going back to this more raw data formats, but we're not going to do that. So here's some questions that I want you to think about, even before we've gone through the steps of the analysis. You're going to be doing long exercises where much of the preparation was already done for you, much of the preparing of the data. So if you're going to be starting a new analysis, you should be asking or thinking, how long would this take in a real analysis? You know, when there's a procedure that's being presented to you, is it something you have to apply to data, to Monte Carlo, to both of them? You know, your facilitators will be asking you to do things a certain way. There must be a reason why you have to do it that way, right? And if you don't know the reason, ask your facilitators. Sometimes you may wonder, are there different options to this approach? Is there one way to do things? If there is, why is it the one way? Or are you just being shown one way, but there could be other approaches? Do you need to redo parts of the procedure? Can you start at this level? Do you have to go further upstream when you go to work on your analysis? For corrections and weighting, does it apply to one particular object in an event, or do you apply it to the full event? And even small details you may not even think about. Where does this part of the analysis run? Does it run on the full grid? Do you have to run it just at or can you run it just at the LPC on Fermilab computers? Can you copy all these data to your home institution and run it there? Do you use CRAB? Do you use Condor? Do you want to be using Docker? Those are details, but You got to figure out how to do them. And for some of this stuff, you may ask, well, who figures this out? Do I figure it out? Do I have to do it all myself? Or has someone already figured out how to approach these things? So think about these questions this week and next week as well. Okay, let's look at the life of an analysis. Let's look at the life cycle of an analysis. Now, you may be thinking, does this apply to my analysis? There are different types of analysis you might be doing. In general, we're all looking for signs of new physics, and you might be looking directly for new physics. We don't look at old bubble chamber pictures like we once used to, but we're still looking in the data for signs of something new. And that might be some invariant mass distribution, some momentum distribution that would be a direct observation of new physics. But you may also be measuring a known quantity, maybe when I say known, we may not know it to the precision that we like. So you may want to measure it very precisely. Sometimes this is done in order to pin down systematics or backgrounds that may affect another analysis, or you measure something very precisely and see if it deviates from new physics, or see if it deviates from the standard model predictions, and this might be signs of new physics. So you may be thinking, well, does this, what you're going to talk about, does it apply to me, these? And yes, we're going to talk about this at a very, very high level. So this bulk picture is very similar between those two. Throughout any of these analyses, what you're going to find is that there's an incredible amount of bookkeeping and taking notes that you have to do, keeping track of files and these numbers that are in the files, the amount of data that was generated, the cross-sections for these, and you're going to have to figure out how to keep track of everything. Sometimes there may be a framework that helps you out. Sometimes you're entering everything in a spreadsheet. So no matter what analysis you're doing, think about how you're going to keep track of all of these things. There's no way to get around it, so start early keeping these notes, whether they're electronic or you write them by hand or whatever. Okay, here's what you do in an analysis, right? And you probably knew this before you got here. That's okay. You got to get the data. You're going to have to get some Monte Carlo. It turns out sometimes you've got to fix the data or Monte Carlo. You'll talk about that. These are these corrections you have to do. And then you calculate physics quantities that you might need. Maybe it's an invariant mass distribution. Maybe it's the output from some machine learning approach. And then you want to keep the signal, throw out the background, right? Keep the signal in your data, throw it out. Then you're going to test your hypothesis, which is there new physics in your data? This is really what we mean when we say fit your data. You're testing some hypothesis. And then you estimate how sure you are of the answer, and then you publish or you defend your thesis. And while you're doing all this, you write your analysis note, maybe the paper, maybe work on your thesis. Throughout this whole process, you should be documenting it, right? So this is the life cycle, and you probably knew this already, but let's look at this maybe in a little bit more detail over the course of this talk, okay? To do that, I'm actually going to start at the end. Let's start at the end of an analysis. This plot is probably familiar to some of you. This is not the discovery of the Higgs boson, but newer data, the run-2 data showing the Higgs boson. And so this is really the final plot at the end of a long series of measurements and analyses. This is the final plot in some paper. And if you just look at this plot itself, you can already see what we may need to figure out, to keep track of for our analysis. When was our data taken? Okay, it says here 2016, 2017, 2018. Okay, that's run 2. How much data did we take? That is, how many protons passed by each other in order for us to record these data? This is this 137.1 inverse femtobarns. It's got the energy up here. We should think about, how did we select the data? Well, it looks like we required 4 leptons. There needs to be at least 4 leptons, it looks like in here. What variable makes our signal look different from the background? And in this case, it looks like we calculated the invariant mass of these 4 leptons because look, oh my gosh, look at this. Here is our signal, and that looks quite different from our background. Remember, your goal when you're looking at discriminating variables is to find a variable in which your signal looks different from background. Now, is our data what we would expect from the standard model? This is the blue as well as this green curves here. Can we compare this to our simulations? And are our simulations simulating things correctly or close enough? And then, of course, what would our new physics look like here? So there's a lot wrapped up in this plot. There was a lot of steps to get to this point. So where did that plot come from? Well, we took a lot of data. The 3 years worth of data, it looks like I chose something actually from before that data was taken, from 2015. But we take lots and lots and lots of collisions, and then we start looking for what we are looking for. In that case, it was the Higgs. Now, I'm going to try to use some very simple cartoon diagrams as we talk about this, mostly for pedagogical purposes, as well as, we want to remind ourselves that even though we will, in the end, produce histograms, those histograms came from, many, many collisions. We represent that as some sort of 4 vectors and energies that have some sort of relative angles between each other. And I personally find it useful to keep thinking about what was happening in our collisions. Can I map this type of picture, some muon, let's say here in blue, inside some jet. Maybe there was a photon that was produced, a couple of electrons. How do I map this onto, our different distributions? So I'm going to use this imagery here. There's some charged hadrons that I'll represent as red. Maybe some of these are jets, depending on how we want to classify our jets. And I'll use these types of cartoon pictures, again, as some kind of mental, linchpin that we can come back to think about the physics that we're analyzing, okay? So we collect a lot of these events. We collide a lot of bunches of photons, and we get a lot of collisions that don't always look like each other. Some of them have muons, some of them have electrons, some of them have lots of jets, some of them have a few jets. And from there, we want to pull out signs of Higgs, supersymmetry, whatever. Now, your job as an analyst is to find the right events, the correct events that may have your signal, exclude the wrong events, and figure out if you figured things correctly. It is never this easy. You never know exactly what are the right events. You never know exactly what are the wrong events, but maybe you can say, well, I'm 20% sure this was signal. Maybe I'm 80% sure this is signal. You'll figure it out. You got this whole week to work it out. Okay, so I come up with a whole bunch of data events, right? Here's our cartoon diagrams for data, and this one has a muon, this one has some photons and some jets. So do these. Oh, here's another one with a muon. Now, when you start to analyze these, you're going to have to store them somewhere. Maybe the LPC, maybe your home institution, and you're going to have to keep track of a few things. Was it run 1? Well, mostly we're using run 2 now. But even then, you're going to have to keep track of what year the data was taken. You're going to have to keep track of, even within a year, there are these kind of sub-periods, which are designated as A to Z, might be confusing with run 2. You'll see this. And of course, well, not of course, because you don't know yet, there's a tag that's associated with them. And that tag tells you when the data was processed. And from there, you could find out what were the conditions that were simulated. You've got to keep track of how many events there are. So in this case, it's 36, but you're going to be dealing with hundreds of thousands, millions, maybe billions. And then you got to keep track of the integrated luminosity, which is really how many protons flew past each other in order to produce these events. So right off the bat, I'm hoping you're seeing that there's some bookkeeping that's going to be going on. You're going to have to keep track of all this information somehow. Text file, spreadsheet, maybe just emailing yourself the numbers. No, don't keep it in email. You'll find a better way, okay? Now, not every event that happens in the detector gets written to tape, but every one that does get written to tape passes something called a trigger. You'll learn about this. This trigger is a very, very quick decision about whether or not this is interesting. Was there a mu on it in your event? Maybe above some given momentum. Did you have lots of jets? Was there a muon and an electron? And when the data is processed, these get filtered to different directories, if you will. These different data sets. To put it very, very, very simply, it's almost oversimplifying it. And some events might actually pass 2 triggers. It's not unique, even though I've drawn it here. I've drawn it here so it looks like each event only satisfies 1 trigger, but that's not the case. I've just done this for simple purposes. But it does mean that if you're trying to do your analysis, you may be able to go very quickly and say, oh, I would like the data from some particular trigger. This actually makes things a little bit easier in this kind of pre-filtering, if you will. Now, when you're doing your analysis, whether it's with the long exercise or your own analysis, think about, why am I using this trigger? Why was this trigger used in this previous analysis? Why did the facilitators choose this trigger? What is it about the physics that makes this trigger more likely to accept my signal and potentially reject the background? Or does it accept both of them and you're willing to take both signal and background as much as possible? It may sound trivial, but at some point you may have to make a decision about what framework you're going to use. Now, when I say framework, that's what set of software tools. And the software tools have evolved, which is probably not surprising, during the time that CMS was running. It'll be up to you, your analysis working group, or your long exercise to figure out what are the software tools that you'll be using. And will you use these different tools at different stages? Do you have to slim your data even more? Are you going to store everything at home, at the LPC? But talk with your facilitators as to what they use for their analyses, what they would recommend going forward. So now you're ready to sit down and do your analysis, and you want all the data, well, as much as you can, from the detector, right? This beautiful, beautiful piece of machinery, this beautiful experiment, this detector that has recorded all of this data, and you want all of it that you can just sink your teeth into and start to analyze. And you're going to find that it's actually kind of hard to access the data. When I remember when I first started working on CMS, and I'm used to taking a file, opening it up on my laptop, analyzing it. Maybe I have to loop over a few files, and then you find it's actually a little bit more difficult. And there's this, what seems like a convoluted procedure. You want to eat like this, but it turns out you've got to eat like this to get the data. But there's a reason for this. It's mostly related to the idea that we just have an incredible amount of data, petabytes upon petabytes of data. And it is non-trivial to access this in a timely manner. We use a tool called XRootD. You will hear some about that this week. But I wanted to kind of acknowledge that there is this kind of frustration at first when you're trying to access all these data and you're using all these scripts to try to get this and submit this job just to get the data, and you're just like, I just want to look at the data. We do have tools for small subsets, but to run over the huge data for your final analysis, there's a reason why you can't just open the file the way you would on your laptop. And you'll learn some of that this week, but I kind of wanted to acknowledge that, yes, you kind of want to jump in. It can be difficult, but there are reasons for that at a real low-level file I/O decision-making process. Okay, so there's the data, but you've also got to now worry about the Monte Carlo, the simulation. You know what the physics is you're looking for, but what physics in the standard model might mimic your physics? This is what we call background. So we can go to Monte Carlo. We can generate pretty much anything that is predicted by the standard model. We have these software tools. These are just a couple of the libraries we use. We've got Pythia, we've got Geant. You'll hear about them more. These can simulate the standard model. And so we put into it not just the standard model, but you may have some theory, some signal that you're looking for. And you put all of this into our software tools and we run it through, and now we can see what these would look like if they occurred in the CMS detector. We run them through the full reconstruction process. So there's Drell-Yawn and jets, Drell-Yawn processes, TT bar events, W bosons and jets, and then, hey, here's your new physics signal. And you can analyze this just like your data. Now, the simulations that we have are really good. Like, we can simulate the passage of an electron through a virtual CMS down to, like, the nuts and bolts, the carbon support rods for our structure. It is incredibly detailed. And the question is, is it good enough? We're not perfect. So if I simulate some event in Monte Carlo, is it good enough? Does it do a good enough job simulating something in data? Does a muon behave in our simulations the same as it does in the real CMS? What about all the noise or the mistakes, pile up? Have we really checked everything? And this is going to be a big part of what you will be doing as an analyst, when you go to do your own physics search. So you'll have your signal Monte Carlo. You'll have probably at least a couple of backgrounds that you have to worry about. Is the signal Monte Carlo already generated? Are you looking for something brand new, or did somebody else kind of look for it already and you just need to update it? What backgrounds do you have to worry about? Who figures out these backgrounds? Is it all on you? Do you have a working group? Was there a previous study that can give you some insight as to what the backgrounds are? How do you figure out how much Monte Carlo is generated for each data set? You have to figure that out. You'll learn that this week, but this is part of the bookkeeping. When you skim your Monte Carlo, you better make sure that your Monte Carlo corresponds to the correct run, the correct year, the correct run period, the correct processing period. This is the tag, the same as your data. Remember this from before. What's the luminosity these Monte Carlos correspond to? And again, you got to keep track of it. Spreadsheet, text file. We have tools now like Coffee that makes this easier for you, but this is why we have these tools, because there is all of this bookkeeping. And right off the bat, you realize, whoa, I guess my Monte Carlo is not the same as my data, because the Monte Carlo doesn't have that trigger, doesn't have that pre-selection. So it's going to be up to you to apply that by hand, given whatever framework you're going to be using. And you'll learn that this week. This trigger is applied to each event in your Monte Carlo, and it's up to you to apply that. You'll find that there's other things that maybe aren't simulated perfectly in the Monte Carlo. There's pileup that you'll learn about. This is the idea that, I send 100 billion protons at 100 billion protons, and you would think that maybe just one proton interacts, maybe two, but there could be 10, 20, 30 protons that all interact with one another, send a whole bunch of stuff flying into our detector, but they were different initial events. Oy. So this is, in some sense, the noise that enters our detector, and when we process the Monte Carlo, we might have made mistakes. So you've got to go back and kind of correct for that, because you can't reprocess this Monte Carlo. So assume that we had 6 proton-proton interactions in this one particular Monte Carlo event. You'll find it's actually quite unlikely. So we have to de-weight this. Every time we fill a histogram with some information from this event, we've got to give it a lower weight, because this probably didn't happen that often. And so you might have a collection of Monte Carlo events, and you figure out what weight should be applied to each one when you fill a histogram. And again, this is because when these data were processed, we made mistakes, and maybe mistake is too harsh of a word, but we did not have as accurate a study of how these extra collisions occurred. And so as we learn more and more about our data set, as we study it better, we can then correct our Monte Carlo But again, instead of going and reprocessing everything, we do these post corrections, these weightings. Now, that's not all you're going to have to worry about. There might be other things you have to do to the Monte Carlo or to the data depending on when it was processed. You may have to worry about the jet energy. Do you have to apply it to both? If you're using the ultra legacy, are all the corrections in there? Are there corrections you need for muons or electrons? You'll be learning this. Is there any other weightings that you need to worry about based on the generated Monte Carlo? Or what about this? You'll hear about smearing. Is the resolution modeled well in the Monte Carlo? This is a lot of your work as an analyst. Okay, so suppose you've done, you've applied as many corrections as, where if you think your Monte Carlo now is a good reflection of your data. So now you've got to select the data. This is the fun part, I would say. And then you've got to compare it to your data. Select the Monte Carlo and your data and compare them. So again, you have some set of data, and then you've got some set of maybe background Monte Carlo events, and then your signal Monte Carlo. So the question is your data completely well described by all of your standard model processes? Does this perfectly describe that? Or do you need to add a little bit of signal? This is the exciting thing, If your data is not completely described by your Monte Carlo, your standard model Monte Carlo, and maybe you need a little bit of extra signal to make things like agree with one another, that's the exciting part. But you got a ways to get there. And notice that there are, the way I've drawn this, again, should make you think about this idea of the bookkeeping. There are fewer events you might have in your data than your Monte Carlo. You may have to just scale it based on the number of events you generated. Okay? So what events do you want to keep of your data? What events do you want to keep of the Monte Carlo? You'll apply the same selection criteria to all of these. How do you make sure you don't bias yourself? You will hear about blind analyses, but that's a big deal. You don't want to, if I have a block of marble, I can find a statue of David in there just by carving out the parts that I don't want. You do not want to just arbitrarily create new physics just by carving it out with biased cuts. You're going to have to learn how to do that. And then you're going to say, hey, look, how do I find these signal events in my data? And what you'll probably find first is that some of your background actually looks like your signal. That's not always fun. You'd like these to look really different from each other, but usually your background looks at least a little bit. You can find events in your background that look like your signal. But again, like I said, that's the fun part. So you're going to have to optimize this selection. You'll apply the same selection criteria, and hopefully you can find some selection that throw out a whole bunch of your background, only throws out a little bit of your signal. And then when you look in your data, hopefully you have enhanced the amount of signal that's remaining, if the signal is there. And how do you optimize that? That's what you're going to get paid for, well, assuming you're getting paid. And the question is there an optimal selection? Depending on the physics you're looking for, you may find that there's no one optimal selection. This is a little bit of the art, if you will, of doing an analysis. And then at the end of it, you're going to have to estimate how well you did. You're going to have to figure out how certain or uncertain you are that you did things properly. And that will be not as much fun, but something we all have to do. So when I say you have to optimize, again, going back to these cartoon pictures, what makes one data event look different from another data event? And you don't really want to do this optimization with your data. You want to go to Monte Carlo and play around with it, because you've got, the standard model predictions, and then you've got your new signal. And so you can play around with both of these. You could say, well, what is it that makes my background look different from the signal? Is it the number of muons on average? Is it the momentum of the muons? Is it the energy of the jets? Is it the angle of the jets relative to the muons? Is it some missing energy? Is it some crazy concoction, some mix-up of all of these, again, some machine learning algorithm that learns to distinguish these? What are good discriminating variables? Again, a discriminating variable is something where my signal looks different from my background. And again, do you need to figure this all out for yourself, or are there guides? Are there previous analyses? Or can you find something? Can you find a discriminating approach that was better than what everybody did before? I think you can. I know you can. So look, even though I've drawn all these great pictures, we don't really look at each event, obviously, and you probably knew that ahead of time. What we do is we find some discriminating variable, and we make some histogram. We accumulate all of these events, and we look at some distribution of them. And we can do the same, for our data, as well as for our Monte Carlo backgrounds. And ideally, we find that, our Monte Carlo, our different backgrounds, produce different shapes, in some discriminating variable is what we'll find. But, never forget that this histogram came from, things that look like that. So what you'll have is your data, and you'll say, well, can I describe this data with a little bit of background 1, a little bit of background 2, and then if I can't get everything in there, what about this signal that I'm looking for? And this is really what a fit is doing. It's, testing this hypothesis of how do I describe this data, and how much of this do I need? How sure am I that I do or do not need, this signal? Can I create some cocktail of these backgrounds, maybe standard model, maybe something beyond the standard model, to describe my data? This is a stacked histogram of the Monte Carlo overlaid with the data. This is just some toy that I had put together for demonstration. Now, once you fit your data, it's not over there. You have to figure out how good is your fit. Is it good enough? What does good enough even mean? Can I use data to estimate the backgrounds? Does that even make sense? Well, it turns out that it will, and you'll learn about how you can use your data to actually estimate some of your backgrounds. All those corrections that, I mentioned before, do those affect your fit? Do you have to take those into account for any uncertainties that you have in the end? How certain were you about these corrections? And you'll hear a lot about systematic effects. How do they enter into the fit or to the final answer? How do you estimate these systematic effects? Are there other Monte Carlo samples that you use for this? I'm asking these leading questions, but you'll see that this week. So let me revisit that life of analysis, right? I said, look, get the data, fix the data, calculate some quantities, throw out the signal, throw out the background, keep the signal, test your hypothesis, estimate it, publish and defend. And now at the end of this, maybe I've given us a little bit more language. So let me make this slightly more sophisticated. What you want to do is you want to identify your data set, the trigger you'll use, the global tag for your data. Same thing with your Monte Carlo samples. You've got to figure out what backgrounds might mimic your signal. Very quickly, you have to decide on a software framework to analyze this and produce your n-tuples, skim it in some way, apply your corrections and your weighting. That's the fix the data in Monte Carlo that I was talking about. And then, optimize your selection. If there is even a perfect way to optimize it, which there isn't, try to find the best of these different approaches and then reduce your backgrounds, but estimate how much background is left. Compare the data in Monte Carlo, this is the fit, and then at the end of the day, you'll have this beautiful upper limit or maybe some observation, and you'll have to estimate that significance. And of course, I do not always take this advice, but try to write your documentation continuously as you go along. And as I'm saying it to you, I'm going to try to do better from my own end. So look, it all seems pretty easy when I put it that way. Of course, the devil is in the details. It is never that easy, but at least maybe this talk provides a roadmap, both for this week and in the years ahead as you're working in your analysis. Do not worry if this did not make complete sense to you, especially those of you who are brand new. That is what this analysis school is for. This is what the next year or two of you coming up to speed is. And I hope that at the end of this week, again, you will return to this talk, see if it was useful. There's a lot to learn. You should be having fun while you're doing this. You will have a worksheet that you can look at that will have some questions on there for you to ask the facilitators, again, both for the long exercise so you understand what and why you're doing it, but also for your own analysis. So when you leave the analysis school, you're ready to hit the ground running. But those questions should not be the end-all be-all. Ask as many questions as you can this week. That is what we are here for. And I hope that you'll approach any of us with any of these questions. If this talk was useful to you, please let us know. If this talk wasn't useful, you can let us know as well, so we know whether or not to keep running it. Thanks for everything. Have a great week. I'm sure I will see you around.